Welcome everybody to Unit 4, the start of our study of macroeconomics. This is Econ 4.1. Take a look at these pictures. What era in history do they represent? If you're thinking the Great Depression, you are correct. The Great Depression was a period of time in our country's history which we suffered a severe economic downturn. How do we know that we suffered a severe economic downturn? What did we look at to know? What numbers did we look at to know that we were suffering? We can see it very clearly, evidenced photographically, but how do we know based on the numbers that we were experiencing an economic downturn? That's what we're going to begin studying in looking at those numbers which indicate whether an economy is healthy, steady, or unhealthy. But before we get to that, let's differentiate between macro and microeconomics. Microeconomics is what we've been studying. Microeconomics is the study of individual pieces that make an economy when we put them together. So this is the makeup of households, businesses, and government. You put all those things together and you get macro, but looking at those each individual components is what gives you microeconomics. So we looked at this when we looked at households, your buying and spending decisions, so when we looked at demand. We also looked at this when we studied prices, when we studied supply, and when we studied how competitive markets are, so different markets for different products. When we put all those things together, we get what's called macroeconomics. Macroeconomics is the analysis of economy-wide factors. So rather than looking at the market for t-shirts, we look at the market for all products. The goal, of course, of macroeconomics is to have a healthy economy. How do we know we have a healthy economy? Well, we have to look at some specific numbers, just like those numbers that you look at to indicate whether or not you and your body are healthy. Economic indicators are goals of a healthy economy. Those economic indicators which indicate whether or not an economy is healthy are as follows: stable prices, low unemployment, and sustained growth. The subsequent videos will get much more in depth into each of these macroeconomic indicators for a healthy economy. We'll just go over a brief introduction to each of these economic goals. The first economic goal, and they're in no particular order, I just gave them a number for our purposes, is stable prices, indicated by P. Stable prices, which means that prices do increase over time. They don't stay the same always. Stable price increases can indicate growth and or inflation. That's not necessarily a bad thing, however. We measure stable prices by looking at what's called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. That's the average price of final goods and services produced in a given year. CPI tells us whether or not those prices are inflating, the prices are rising, which decreases your money's purchasing power, or if those prices are deflating or falling, which increases your ability to purchase the same products in an economy. A little bit more about inflation. Inflation is a sustained increase in the average price level of the entire economy. So it's not just the sustained increase of gas, it's the sustained increase of gas, plus bread, plus shoes, plus pedicures, plus home construction, etc. Inflation is considered positive if it occurs somewhere between 2 and 4% in a certain period of time, generally between a quarter and a year. In shooting for that, that means that the economy is growing because things are becoming more expensive, but on a steady and slow scale. Inflation can be caused by an expanding money supply, which we'll get into later in the unit. Inflation can lead to distortions, which are funny-looking numbers as far as consumption, what we're buying, what we're saving, and what we're investing in. Inflation can also cause a loss of confidence in the nation's financial markets, as we saw in the great stock market crash of 1929, and additionally the stock market crash of late 2008. Hyperinflation is said to occur when prices have risen 200% or more for 1 year. There have been some historical examples of this, however not in the United States. Inflation, again, is calculated by the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index, in the next video we'll get into this much more in depth, is the average prices in 1 year compared to another. So take the average prices in the year you were born versus average prices today. Which one's going to be higher? Well, we have an actual number that tells us how much they've changed. The percent change is what we call the actual inflation rate. Again, we want that to be somewhere between 2 and 4% per year. However, we can't look at CPI and inflation alone as measuring the health of a nation's economy, just like you wouldn't look at blood pressure alone in measuring the health of a person. The next economic goal, goal number 2, is sustained growth. We measure this by Q, or quantity, to see if our economy is growing or producing more. We measure sustained growth. We have numbers for sustained growth by measuring what's called GDP, gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the total market value of all final goods and services produced within the borders of a country in 1 year. Every component of this definition is very specific. Sustained growth, as it says above, tells us if we're doing better and how much better we're doing and at what rate is good. So this is the difference from going to an F to a C minus. Are we doing better? Yes. But are we doing it fast enough? Does a C minus to a C make that much of a difference? What rate is a good rate? So these are the things that we consider when looking at whether or not GDP is good, bad, or just okay. We also understand sustained growth, whether or not our economy is growing, by looking at what we call aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand is the total demand, and aggregate supply is the total supply for all goods and services in a national economy. So it's not just the demand for new jeans or the demand for new cars, it's the demand for all products in addition to the demand supply of all products. Sustained growth, again, is measured partly by GDP. GDP counts final goods and services only. Okay? Final goods and services, such as manicures, bread, cruise missiles we use for defense, and factories. It does not count intermediate goods or goods that are used to make other things. It only counts those final goods. Like, it doesn't count the flour for making the bread or the bolts that go into a missile. It just counts the final product. So it is somewhat challenging to accurately measure our country's true GDP. There are 4 components of GDP, which the next videos will get into more in depth. Those 4 components are C, which stands for consumer goods and services, G, which stands for government goods and services, so things that the government produces and purchases, I, which stands for investment, things that businesses purchase, and net exports, which is our exports, standing for X, minus our imports. Exports minus imports give us our net exports. If we add these 4 things up together, consumer spending, government spending, investment, and our net exports, we get our GDP, or our gross domestic product, which is the national income that is produced in a nation's borders in 1 year. A little bit more on GDP. GDP can either be nominal, that means not adjusted for inflation, that means GDP in today's dollars, or it can be real GDP, which is GDP adjusted for inflation. It measures growth from 1 year to the next year in terms of the dollar prices of the base year. This might be confusing now, but when you watch the videos on GDP, hopefully it'll become a little bit more clear. This is just to provide you a little introduction, perhaps a little background before you watch the more in-depth videos. The goal for GDP is a growth rate of 2 to 4% change over a given year. If you look at google.com/public data, it is a wealth of all this great information about GDP, GDP in reference to population growth, and all these other indicators that you can certainly use for your project, which will come after you watch all of the videos and do the activities about GDP, inflation, and unemployment. The third macroeconomic goal for a healthy economy is low unemployment, signified by the letter U. We don't say zero unemployment, and we'll learn why that is. Low unemployment, or unemployment, is simply the number of people of working age seeking a job but without employment. It's measured by the unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate does not count kids who are in school, so it doesn't count you guys. It also doesn't count the elderly who are retired, nor does it count women or men who are staying home to raise families. Again, this is measured by the unemployment rate. Each state and the nation measures their own unemployment rate. We measure this constantly. We're constantly looking at these numbers. These numbers are released monthly, quarterly, that's 4 times per year, each quarter, 4 quarters in a year, and annually, or once per year. 5% unemployment is considered a general goal for unemployment. We'll talk about why 0% would not be a good goal. Nevada currently has the highest unemployment in the nation at 9.5%. That means 9.5% of people of working age seeking a job cannot find one. North Dakota has the lowest unemployment rate in the country at just 3%. Most of that can be attributed to the oil drilling that has been occurring in North Dakota for the last several years. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We'll talk a little bit more about these in subsequent videos because I don't want to give you too much information to overwhelm you or confuse you at this point. If we think about these goals, these three goals, stable prices, sustained growth, and low unemployment, and the Great Depression, here are what some of these numbers look like. During the Great Depression, the unemployment rate was about 25%, which is extremely high. We've never seen an unemployment rate that high since we've been measuring for unemployment, aside from the Great Depression. Deflation was occurring, which means that your dollar would buy you more, which is great if you had dollars, but most people were suffering from an income issue during that time period. Real GDP, that means GDP adjusted for inflation, fell from 1929 to 1933. There are very few instances in our country's history, since we've been measuring GDP, or the national income of our total economy, where this has occurred. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply decreased across the board. Again, that has rarely happened for a sustained level of time in our country's history. Some of the causes of the Great Depression, if you remember back from U.S. history, were excessive spending in the 1920s, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which severely reduced the number of imports and raised tariffs to a very high level in this country, the stock market crash of October 1929, and the banking collapse and the supply of money drying up. So there wasn't just one cause of the Great Depression, and we'll get a little bit more in depth into that as we look at some of these economic indicators like unemployment, stable prices, and sustained growth. What's next? So now that you've had a little introduction to the macroeconomic goals for a healthy economy, sustained growth, stable prices, and low unemployment, you're going to watch some videos produced by Dr. McGlasson. You've watched a few of these before. These are the fun little cartoon videos. And use your Unit 4A Economic Indicators video guide as you watch episodes 16 through 24 of her video list. All of these are available on Moodle for you to browse. They are not available on my podcasts. Then you're going to begin your economic indicator project. Pay attention to the due dates on the Moodle calendar.